upon their assuming or returning to office. And of course, the Code sets out the behaviour expected of all those who serve in government. It provides guidance to ministers on how they should act and arrange their affairs to uphold these standards. The Code exists and should be read alongside the overarching duty on ministers to comply with the law and to protect the integrity of public life. The current version of the Code was issued by the Prime Minister in August 2019, shortly after he assumed office. While the Code sets out standards and offers guidance, it is ministers who are personally responsible for deciding how to act and conduct themselves in the light of the Code, and of course for justifying their actions and conduct to Parliament and to the public. That is as it should be in a robust democracy such as ours. Ministers are not employees of the government, but rather office holders, who hold their office for as long as they have the confidence of the Prime Minister as the head of government. It is always, therefore, the Prime Minister who is the ultimate judge of the standards of behaviour expected of an individual minister and of the appropriate consequences were a breach of those standards to occur. Mr. Speaker, the Code also sets out a role for an independent adviser on ministers' interests. It is an important role, the principal duty of which is to provide independent advice to ministers on the arrangement of their private interests. The independent adviser also has a role in investigating alleged breaches of the ministerial code. As the House will be aware, Sir Alex Allen stepped down from his role towards the end of last year, and following the practice of successive administrations, the Prime Minister will appoint a successor to Sir Alex. The House will understand that the process of identifying the right candidate for such a role can take time. However, an appointment is expected to be announced shortly, and of course the House will be informed in the usual way as soon as that appointment is confirmed. It will clearly be an early priority for the new independent adviser to oversee the publication of an updated list of ministers' interests, and I expect that will be published shortly after a new independent adviser is appointed. I can, of course, reassure the House that the process of managing ministers' interests has continued in the absence of an independent adviser, in line with the Ministerial Code, which sets out that the Permanent Secretary in each department and the Cabinet Office overall have a role. Ministers remain able to seek advice on their interests from their Permanent Secretary and from the Cabinet Office. The Ministerial Code has served successive administrations well and has been an important tool in upholding standards in public life. It will continue to do so.
Right. Let us go to SNP spokesperson for the urgent question, Alison Thewlis. Alison, order. Can I just say to members that they should be wearing a mask in the chamber? For the two members who sat here, please, it's not my decision, it's the decision of Public Health England that we should be wearing masks. If you don't wish to, please leave the chamber. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. I think we're going to have to order. I think we're going to have to suspend the sittings if members aren't going to wear them. It's not my orders. It's orders that have come. Sorry about that. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. In his foreword to the Ministerial Code, the Prime Minister says, to win back the trust of the British people, we must uphold the very highest standards of propriety, to no misuse of taxpayer money, no actual or perceived conflicts of interest, and that the precious principles of public life enshrined in the Code, integrity, objectivity, accountability, transparency, honesty, and leadership in the public interest must be honoured at all times. Well, Mr. Speaker, this UK Tory government is failing on all counts. They are riddled with conflicts of interest and allegations of corruption, and indeed 37% of the public think the Prime Minister is corrupt. 53% think that in Scotland. And that's before getting into the latest on what the Prime Minister is alleged to have said, that he'd rather see bodies pile up in their thousands rather than order a third lockdown. Despicable, cruel and callous. Comments not befitting the office of Prime Minister. Transparency International, in their report Track and Trace, raised serious questions on 73 government contracts worth £3.7 billion. And of these, 24 PPE contracts worth £1.6 billion have been handed to those with known political connections, with a further £536 million on testing services. Mr. Speaker, we need to know who has benefited, what their links are to ministers, especially in the light of the VIP lane that the National Audit Office have identified as a risk, where people are 10 times more likely to win a contract if they were on that list. Transparency International have identified the VIP lane as a potential systemic and partisan bias in the award of PPE contracts. So will the Minister stop hiding behind commercial confidentiality and publish in full the details of these VIP contracts, along with who recommended them? It's our money, Mr Speaker, and we have a right to know. Will he finally publish also the updated register of ministers' interests? From the contracts to the Health Secretary's pub landlord, to the cosy chumocracy of the Greensill Capital affair, to the casual text messages between the Prime Minister and Sir James Dyson promising to fix tax issues, apparently in exchange for ventilators we never even got, and now questions over the Prime Minister's funding for feathering his Downing Street nest. Mr Speaker, I wonder if the Minister will agree with me that this is a clear pattern of behaviour and it absolutely stinks. This UK Tory government is about to prorogue this House to duck further scrutiny. In the absence of an independent advisor to investigate ministers, we cannot no longer trust them to investigate themselves, and that much is clear. So will the Minister for the Cabinet Office instead instruct a full, independent public inquiry to get to the bottom of this sleek, grubby cabal in charge of the UK?
Minister Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising a number of issues. She raised the whole question of procurement of PPE. It is a fact, well attested, that less than 0.5% of the PPE procured did not meet the standards that we had set out. It is a fact that every single recommendation for the procurement of PPE went through an independent 8-stage process verified by independent civil servants. It is the case that the government, operating at a time when the pandemic was raging, did everything possible, and we make no apology for it, to make sure that those at the front line got the equipment that they deserved. And the techniques that we used and the processes that we followed not only stand up to scrutiny, they were the same techniques and the same processes used by the Welsh Government, by the Scottish Government and by the Northern Ireland Executive. She raises the Greensill question. Of course, the truth is that all the efforts on behalf of that company in order to push the Treasury and others were rejected. She raises the issue of Sir James Dyson. She doesn't acknowledge the fact that Sir James spent millions of pounds of his own money in order to try to ensure that we had ventilators to save those on the front line. She doesn't mention that the ventilator challenge was investigated by the Public Accounts Committee, who said it was a model of public procurement. She doesn't mention the fact that the changes to the Prime Minister's flat were paid for by the Prime Minister himself. And she repeats a line from a newspaper, but she ignores the fact that the Prime Minister not only instituted a second but also a third lockdown to keep us safe. What she doesn't mention is that she and other opposition members criticised the appointment of a vaccine czar as cronyism, when Kate Bingham has been responsible for saving millions of lives. What she doesn't say is that opposition MPs criticised Kate Bingham for spending money on PR when that money was there to ensure that people from BAME backgrounds were able to get the vaccines that they required. What she doesn't acknowledge is the determined effort by public servants in this government and others to deal with the pandemic and to save lives. Instead, she tries to score political points in a way, sadly, which causes regret.
Sir Bernard Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend a great deal of the things that my right honourable friend has just said. But let's face it, there is not a great deal of public confidence in propriety and ethics in politics in this country, and that is to be laid at the door of all political parties over a very long period. And what would begin to restore public confidence in these matters would be to have more genuine discussion about principles and values and how conflicts of interest should be better managed, and have rather less quibbling about whether we're inside or outside certain rules, or and have fewer accusations and perhaps less blaming as well. Can I commend my right honourable friend to the letter sent by the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life to the Prime Minister last week, which recommended a number of changes to the role, that he should be able to initiate his own inquiries or her own inquiries, should be able to publish a summary of their findings. And he also recommended that the Prime Minister should retain the right to decide on any sanction for a breach of the code, and that it is disproportionate for the Prime Minister always to require a resignation for a breach of the code. He should be able to use a range of sanctions to deal with breaches of the code. Will the government accept these recommendations?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a characteristically thoughtful series of points, and as a former chairman of the PACAC Select Committee and as, of course, current leading Select Committee chairman in this House, I think the points that he makes are certainly points that we should reflect on. It is the case that the process of holding ministers and others to account is always an evolutionary process. We should look at thoughtful recommendations such as those that have been made by Lord Evans and others and consider what more can be done. But I think it's important to stress that this government has already introduced a series of changes in order to ensure greater transparency in public life. But of course, we always seek to do better.
We now come to Shadow Minister Rachel Reeves.
There must be no bullying or harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money, and no actual or perceived conflicts of interests. These words are from the Prime Minister's foreword to the Ministerial Code. I don't know whether he believed them when he wrote them, but he's certainly trampling all over them today. The Prime Minister is now corrupting the standards of public life expected in high office. And as he dodges questions and tries to cover up payments for the luxury refurbishment of his flat, feathering his own nest and possibly breaking the law through undeclared loans. Now, as for leaks, we are seeing the pipes burst with a sewage of allegations. Mr. Speaker, they say that the fish rots from the head down. Well, there is a reason why there is no independent adviser on ministerial standards, and there is a reason why the government won't publish the long overdue list of ministerial interests. And that reason is because the Prime Minister hasn't wanted them. This is a Prime Minister who would rather let the bodies pile high than act on scientific advice. Mr. Speaker, they are not bodies, they are people, they are loved ones, and they are deeply missed. So can I ask the Minister to engage with the issues at hand? When will the government publish the register of ministers' financial interests? Who paid the invoices for the Prime Minister's flat refurbishment in the first place? And when were those funds repaid? And when will the review by the Cabinet Secretary into this fiasco be complete? When will the vacancy for the independent adviser on ministerial standards be filled? And will they given the powers, as the Right Honourable Gentleman has said, to trigger independent investigations as recommended by Lord Evans? And finally, will the Minister apologise for the stomach-churning comments that have come out today and urgently announce a public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic? Because this is all about conduct, character and decency. And frankly, our country deserves an awful lot better than this.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her questions, and as ever, she raises a number of significant issues. On the whole question of the number 10 Downing Street refurbishment, I think it's important to stress that previous Prime Ministers have used taxpayers' money in order to refurbish number 10 Downing Street. In 1998 to 1999, in real terms, the then Prime Minister spent £73,000 in that year of taxpayers' money on refurbishing Downing Street. Between 2000 and 2001, £55,000. Then again, 2007, 2008, £35,000, all taxpayers' money. This Prime Minister has spent his own money on refurbishing Downing Street, and I think that is a distinction that the Honourable Lady should pay close attention to. The Honourable Lady also suggests that the government did not act on scientific advice in dealing with this pandemic. I hope she'll reflect on those words and recognise that is completely wrong. This government, as I pointed out, has initiated not just a second but a third lockdown in response to medical and to scientific advice. And this government, working with doctors and with scientists, has ensured that we have had the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and that we have also developed many of the therapeutics and many of the tools necessary to ensure that those who are suffering in pain at last receive relief. And of course, the ventilators that this government played a part in procuring are now helping to save lives in India. And of course, the Honourable Lady is right to say that we should appoint an independent adviser on ministerial interests as soon as possible. But as I mentioned earlier in my statement, that appointment is due within days, and that independent adviser will have the freedom to carry out their role in exactly the way that they should. Scrutiny is always welcome, but it is also the case that, as the Honourable Lady should point out, or should recognise, that scrutiny should extend beyond those who are our political opponents and also to the parties that we ourselves are leading or members of. And I can only quote from the Times at the weekend, when one of their columnists talked about, quotes, our only proper bit of suspected corruption in this country, in Labour-run Liverpool. The allegations have got everything. Dubious contracts, records created retrospectively, discarded in skips or destroyed altogether. She must look at the beam in her own eye before criticising the mote in others.
On pen rails.
Mr. Speaker, can I pick up on the excellent point made by my right honourable friend, the Chairman of the Liaison Committee, about the powers of the next occupant of the position of the Prime Minister's advisor on the Ministerial Code, and encourage him to go down that road. The proposals made by the Chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life exactly match ones that I made to his committee about a month and a half ago. And it just strikes me that we are at a point now where strengthening the entire system so that it commands cross-party confidence and trust is a point which we have now reached, and these will be very welcome, widely appreciated on all sides, if this is a step which we could ultimately take.
Again, my right honourable friend makes a very important point, and the work that he has done in order to improve standards in public life has been applauded across parties and across this House and indeed outside it. And I think it is the case that the government and the new independent advisor on ministerial standards will want to reflect on Lord Evans' recommendation and indeed other points in order to make sure that we can have the maximum confidence in our system.
Let's come to SNP spokesperson Stuart Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend from Glasgow Central for securing this important, urgent question? PPE contracts awarded to donors and cronies without a robust tender process. NHS contracts awarded to a firm partly owned by the Health Secretary. Privileged secret communications between an ex-Prime Minister and the Chancellor, between James Dyson and the current Prime Minister. I could add a Tory fondness for oligarchs and the allegation of Tory donors funding the Prime Minister's home improvements. And there's no point in the Minister sitting there, part bombast and part Teflon Dawn, hoping this stench of cronyism will simply pass. It's far too late for that. So let me ask, when did this government judge that integrity, probity, transparency and the ministerial code were obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to always be adhered to?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is always a skilled and gifted rhetorician. But as I pointed out in response to his colleague when she raised this urgent question, if you look at PPE, the processes by which PPE have been procured by this government have been independently validated and assured by officials, an 8-step process in order to ensure that contracts were only awarded to those who could provide the right equipment. And there's no variance in the approach that this government took to the approach that the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government took in the procurement of PPE. He talks about a Tory fondness for oligarchs, and he makes reference to text messages and so on. Well, I can only point out that our mutual friend, the Rural Economy Secretary in the Scottish Government, dined with Mr Lex Greensill and Mr Gupta in, I think, one of Glasgow's finest restaurants. If there is a particular fondness for dining with oligarchs, it is not the preserve of any one individual or party in this House, I might point out. And as for suggesting that the ministerial code is something to be got round or overlooked, and suggesting that propriety might be something that needs to be looked at, I would simply refer him to the report of the Independent Committee of the Scottish Parliament into the investigation into the former First Minister. If people want to see a story of obstruction, obfuscation, prevarication and a waste of taxpayers' money, they can find it there.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents are sick and tired of this endless tittle-tattle. They just want their lives to go back to normal, which is what this government is helping them achieve. They couldn't care less about the Prime Minister's cushions or his curtains. Minister, when will we have an opposition that cares about the actual priorities and not who the Downing Street decorators are?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point. It does seem sometimes as though the opposition and some critics are more concerned about the world of interiors than the real world in which the rest of us live. And the really important thing is that we welcome scrutiny when it is there to ensure that we are serving the public. So it's quite right that there should be scrutiny over how we respond to the pandemic. It's quite right that we should resolve to learn lessons from everything that this government has done. But it is also right for those who are in this House, who have the opportunity to scrutinise the way in which taxpayers' money is spent, to look effectively at the delivery of public policy rather than necessarily seeking to make partisan points.
Lyra Hobhouse. Lyra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has just said public scrutiny is always welcome. So instead of all these reports relying on leaks in the newspaper and on accusations on Dominic Cummings' blog, doesn't the Minister agree that the best way forward would be to get all the facts straight, an independent public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic, and will he urge the Prime Minister to go ahead with it without delay?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady makes a very fair point. I think we do need, in due course, an independent public inquiry into dealing with the pandemic, but I think it's important that we concentrate now on the successful vaccine rollout, on making sure that the roadmap and the lifting of restrictions to which so many people are quite rightly looking forward is in place. There will be time for an independent public inquiry, and there will be lessons to be learned. Mistakes have been made, but I think it's important that we concentrate now on making sure that our economy is restored to health, that public services get back to the level that they should be, and also that we deal with this virus once and for all.
Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt that the allegations made by the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central are serious, but there's also very little doubt that we work in a profession where claims and counterclaims are often made with scant reliance on evidence. Transparency and openness is really important to retaining the trust of this House and the people who put us here. So with that in mind, can my right honourable friend confirm that any donations and benefits given will be returned and made open and transparent through the regular processes?
My honourable friend makes an important point, and it is the case that all of us have a responsibility to declare political donations. There is a clear means of doing so, and I know that all donations received by all politicians in this House will be declared appropriately.
Let's go to Dame Margaret Hodge. Dame.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the government claimed that the Prime Minister funded the upfront costs of decorating Downing Street flat himself. This afternoon, the Prime Minister did not, Mr. Speaker, deny that the upfront costs were met by Conservative Party donors. This is not the first, but the third time in the space of just 1 week when the Prime Minister has been caught out. How many more times will government ministers accept that their leader, our Prime Minister, has misled the public, the press and Parliament before they declare him unfit for office?
Unintentional. Mr. Gove.
Well, I have enormous respect for the Right Honourable Lady, a brave and courageous fighter for many causes and a very, very distinguished former Select Committee chairman. But I think the specific allegation she makes against the Prime Minister she may wish to reflect on the broader point of substance that she raises. As I pointed out earlier, the Prime Minister paid for the costs of renovation. Declarations are properly made about political donations, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary pointed out when being questioned by the PACAC committee earlier that he is making sure that everything that was done in accordance with the rules.
Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary confirm that this Conservative government has taken more steps to reform and regulate lobbying and public procurement than any previous Labour government? And it was indeed the case that at the last general election, the Labour Party intended to scrap the same lobbying law that they now want to strengthen. Does this not show the hypocrisy of Captain Hindsight?
Absolutely right.
Yeah, my honourable friend is absolutely right. I don't know why they're making a noise on the other side. It was the case that this government banned the use of taxpayers' money for Quanga lobbying. It banned taxpayers' money being used in grants for other organisations lobbying. It introduced a statutory registrar of lobbyists, and it's also had transparency measures, which we've introduced, on government spending, government salaries, government contracts, government tenders, and government meetings. And he's quite right. The party opposite said that they wanted to scrap that legislation as well. Now, it's for the party opposite to justify to people in Redcar and Hartlepool why it is they want to scrap lobbying regulation, and it will be interesting to hear that conversation on the doorsteps.
Let's go to Howell Williams. Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In PMQs 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister agreed with me that politicians must not lie. This is vital to the credibility of the ministerial code. but a host of recent events, including the Prime Minister's reported comments regarding lockdowns, raise serious questions about the government's adherence to that very ministerial code. Is he confident that his answers today are sufficiently comprehensive and sufficiently robust to lay these matters to rest?
Yes.
Right, let's go to Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I read through the ministerial code this morning. It took me longer than most members because I'm slower. But I could see absolutely nothing in that that would make me think the Prime Minister's done anything wrong. So why don't we leave it to the system to investigate this matter if there's a requirement for it, rather than dance to the tune of a media frenzy?
Well, my honourable friend is an officer and a gentleman, and he puts the point very well. There are tried and tested procedures and principles in order to make sure that ministers and others in this House behave in an appropriate way. Judgments can be made, of course, by all of us in a democracy. And the final thing that I would say is that his reading of the ministerial code this morning may, of course, be a prelude to him being appointed as a minister in due course, but I cannot further speculate on these matters.
Let's go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Contrary to what one government minister said at the weekend, concerns about the Prime Minister and the ministerial code are not tittle-tattle. People care deeply about this, which is why Peter Stevanovich's video on the Prime Minister's relationship with the truth has been viewed nearly 13 million times on social media. So my question is this: if the ministerial code says that any inadvertent error should be corrected at the earliest opportunity, what should be done about systematic, deliberate errors? And if, as seems to be the case with our archaic and dysfunctional rules, it is the Prime Minister himself who decides whether the ministerial code has been broken, should we really be trusting this one to mark his own homework? Or should the whole system not be urgently revised?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes a number of important points. I think the first thing that I would say is that she's absolutely right, that the public do have a right to expect that those who are responsible for discharging government duties and spending taxpayers' money do so in a way that's consonant with the public's values. That's absolutely right. And she also makes a broader point about the need always to review the mechanisms of scrutiny to which government are subject. As was pointed out earlier by the member for Harwich and North Essex, and also by the member for Weston-super-Mare, there is an opportunity to look again, with the appointment of a new independent advisor on ministerial interests, on how that role, and indeed perhaps other roles, can be strengthened if necessary.
Let's go to Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst these matters should always be open and transparent, one can only muse at what other world leaders think of the UK Prime Minister having to pay for his own refurbishment and additional tax for the benefit in kind, and of course the personal payment for the running costs of the flat we insist he stays in. Surely my right honourable friend agrees with me. The ridiculous situation here is why our Prime Minister should be paying anything at all personally, unlike other world leaders, when it is us, the taxpayer, who demands they live above the shop.
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and it is the case that there are existing trusts that are responsible for looking after Dorneywood and Chequers, where Labour and indeed where Labour, Liberal Democrat and Conservative politicians have used those facilities in order to discharge their duties. And Downing Street is a working building, and it is appropriate, as has been the case in the past, as I referred to earlier, that there is some public money which is allocated in order to ensure that the Prime Minister and others who work in that building can perform their duties as appropriate. Of course, when we're spending taxpayers' money, we must have a care. We must recognise that this is money which is entrusted to us. But of course, when it comes to government buildings, particularly government buildings like Downing Street, there is a role for public funding in making sure that they function effectively on all our behalves.
Let's go to Geraint Davis. Geraint. In which case, let's go to Jack Merriton. Jack.
It's the best speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that if the leader of the opposition was really serious about tackling corruption, he would start by cracking down on the Labour government in Wales, which handed out NHS contracts worth more than £650,000 to a Labour activist without any kind of competitive tendering process.
Shocking.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for bringing that case to my attention. I wasn't aware of it, but I am sure that the Leader of the Opposition and others will want to make sure that all the correct procedures have been followed.
Let's go to Tamnajit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, whether it's the Prime Minister's luxury refurbishment of his flat, day after day, more sordid, sleazy details are unearthed about this incompetent Conservative government, which is now, frankly, becoming an embarrassment for our nation, given the billions wasted on crony COVID contracts. Tory donors have been profiteering at the British taxpayers' expense in the midst of widespread public misery. So can the Secretary of State inform the House, why is he blocking, why is he delaying the public inquiry into the handling of the pandemic, so that we can all ascertain for ourselves just how many ministers have broken the ministerial code by texting or handing out government contracts to their Tory chums?
As I pointed out in response to some earlier questions, it is the case that every single PPE contract that was awarded went through an 8-stage process. It was supervised by independent civil servants, and the idea that there was any, how can I put it, the imputation that lies behind, his comments, I think is unfair to those dedicated public servants who worked incredibly hard at a difficult time in order to make sure that those on the front line received exactly what they needed. Now, of course, it is the case that there needs to be an inquiry in due course, but that inquiry should cover every aspect of the handling of the pandemic, and we should all be suitably humble in recognising that that inquiry will necessarily make recommendations that all of us should take account of as we prepare for future health and other challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that all ministers, both at the Treasury and at BEIS, followed the ministerial code in all of their dealings with Greensill Capital?
Yes, and the point that was made earlier is that when Lex Greensill and others with whom he was working were making representations to government, those representations were dealt with in an appropriate way, and the critical thing is that the efforts that they were soliciting were rejected, and that is quite clear.
Stephen Flynn.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, attached to the ministerial code are the 7 principles of public life, and indeed the first of these is selflessness, and it states that holders of public office should act solely in terms of the public interest. Well, today we've had a number of sources state that the Prime Minister shouted in a rage that he would rather see the bodies piled high in their thousands than order a third lockdown. Does the Minister not accept that a Prime Minister who does not put public health first is no Prime Minister at all?
Let me deal with this. I was in the meeting that afternoon with the Prime Minister and other ministers as we looked at what was happening with the virus, with the pandemic, and we were... Look, we're dealing with one of the most serious decisions this Prime Minister and any government has had to face. People have been pointing out quite rightly that tens of thousands of people were dying. The Prime Minister made a decision in that meeting to trigger a second lockdown. He made a subsequent decision to trigger a third lockdown. This is the Prime Minister who was in a hospital himself in intensive care. The idea that he would say any such thing, I find incredible. I was in that room. I never heard language of that kind. And I'm afraid that the honourable gentleman, by seeking to make the points in the way that he does, I think diverts attention from the fact that so many people who have been affected by this pandemic rely on the government, the NHS and others to strain every sinew. These decisions are never easy, but the government made the decision and the Prime Minister made the decision to have a second and third lockdown. And I think we can see the evidence of the leadership that he showed then, not just in the courage that he showed, but also in the success of the vaccination programme from which people across this whole United Kingdom have benefited.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that people in glass houses should not throw stones? And Does my right honourable friend also agree that there is an election next week and the party opposite are behind in the polls and they have chosen to wheel out a mantra from 20 years ago that they thought worked then and perhaps works now? And if we're talking about wheeling out glass houses, may I mention the member under criminal investigation for fraud, the Liverpool mayor arrested for fraud, and a past Labour Prime Minister who pocketed millions from advising big businesses and foreign governments.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and I think it is this, that we all have a responsibility to learn lessons, learn from the past, do our best to make sure that we collectively maintain high standards in public life, acknowledge that there are human frailties in individuals who represent all of the parties in this House, and do our very best to learn from the past.
Mr. Speaker, does the Minister know the identity of the person who gave the Prime Minister the money to pay for the refurbishment of the Downing Street flat? Either he doesn't know, in which case he shouldn't be at the dispatch box saying there's no problem at all, or he does know, in which case he should just tell us what the name is. Can he do that now, please?
Well, the person who paid for the renovations in the Downing Street flat was Boris Johnson.
Andrew Griffith. Online. Andrew Griffith.
Right honourable friend agree that this UK government is almost painfully transparent by any yardstick, and that while sessions such as this may be an inevitable part of the disinfecting oxygen of publicity, it is a bit rich for the honourable member for Glasgow Central to raise concerns when they want the UK to rejoin the EU, a body which hasn't had its audit signed off for decades.
Minister.
My honourable friend makes an important point. You know, the governments of all stripes can always do better, but I think it is fair to say that over generations and across parties, there's been a determined effort by our prime ministers to do everything they can in order to make sure that our democracy stays healthy. Of course, prime ministers in the past have made mistakes, but I think it's important that we recognise that overall, we can have confidence in institutions like this House of Commons to hold them to account.
Let's go to Andy Slaughter. Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has a specific duty to ensure transparency in government through the Freedom of Information Act. Is he concerned that Transparency International last year identified 9 unremedied breaches of the ministerial code? Why is information withheld in government FOI responses more often than not? And is he still running his FOI clearinghouse to delay and filter FOI responses?
Well, the Freedom of Information Clearinghouse, sadly, is not mine. It was set up under a Labour government. So it's a Blairite inheritance. And what it exists to do is to make sure that freedom of information responses are effectively coordinated and that we do everything we can in order to make sure that we comply with the terms of that legislation. But of course, one of the points about the freedom of information legislation is that it needs to be a safe space for frank advice to be offered by officials to ministers, and it's important for the good conduct of government that that safe space remains.
Let's go to Danny Kruger. Danny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do need to get the system of regulation and accountability right. But I echo the point made earlier by my right honourable friend, the chairman of the Liaison Committee, that most of all, we need a culture of values and public service to run through what ministers, ex-ministers and officials do. We'll never write rules so perfect that people don't have to make judgments about who they see and what they do. But to shore that up, we really do need a culture of transparency. So will he confirm that the independent review into the Greensill affair will have full access to all the documents and to all the decision makers involved?
Yes, my honourable friend makes a very good point, well, two actually, about the importance of culture complementing rules, but also about the review that's being undertaken by Nigel Boardman. Nigel Boardman will be given all the details he needs about any contacts between individuals within government and those acting on behalf of Greensill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Cabinet Office Secretary says that he welcomed this question today, and for once I actually believe him, because there's nothing that he likes more than seeing the remaining shreds of the Prime Minister's credibility for probity being blown into the wind. But we know that he will look forward to an opportunity to finally get his own head down in that lavishly furnished apartment above number 10 Downing Street. So can he tell us, when we come to the next Conservative Party leadership contest, and once again he'll be persuaded to put his hat in the ring, is he really saying that the way that this government has operated is acceptable and is the way that we should really expect a government to operate? Is he really able to say that?
Yes.
Right, in which case, let's go to Anthony.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 12 months, honourable and right honourable members from both sides of the House have stood up and made sure the offers of support from local businesses have reached ministers at the right time in the right way, because that's how we've supported people across the country. So would my right honourable friend agree that doing that and making sure those offers got to the right place at the right time has been an important part of getting PPE and ventilators and vaccines to people across the United Kingdom when they needed them most?
My own friend is absolutely right. The government was operating, as all governments were, to be fair, in difficult circumstances, with a clear demand that we do everything possible to source PPE. And as has been pointed out, the overwhelming majority of the PPE that we sourced was sourced in a way that was rigorous, so that the equipment was fit for purpose, and so that those at the front line could benefit.
Let's go to Jamie Stone. Jamie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wonder, does the Secretary of State agree with me that a version of a ministerial code should apply to the leaders of new political parties who might possibly be receiving payments from the arms of overseas governments who don't hold dear to their heart the best interests of the United Kingdom?
I don't want to embarrass the honourable gentleman too much by saying that almost every time he asks a question or makes a point in this House of Commons, I think how lucky his constituents are to have him as their Member of Parliament. And I think even though we disagree on many issues, he puts his finger on an important point of public scrutiny at this time as people decide how to cast their votes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? There's only one party in this House that stands guilty of ignoring votes in a parliament to which it's responsible, that withholds legal advice, that spends thousands of pounds trying to cover its backs in a botched court case, and its leader has been found guilty by a cross-party committee of that parliament of misleading that parliament. Not this party, but the party of the honourable lady who brought this question today, the Scottish National Party, the real cosy sleepy cabal that's running Scotland at this time.
Well, I couldn't put it better myself. But what the surprising thing is, where are the SNP's MPs now? Now, some people might think that turning up, reading out a question, and then leaving before the debate is concluded was the perfect definition of a cynical political stunt, but I'll leave it for other people to decide.
Let's go to Drew Hendry. Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is trying to say that there's absolutely nothing to see here over contracts for cronies, shady deals for decorating, text messages for tax breaks, and peerages for donations. If that's the case, I'm the public entitled to see this examined in a full, independent public inquiry. If not, what is he afraid of?
Well, there are a number of issues which might be, as I'm sure the honourable gentleman is aware, appropriately the subject of a full, independent public inquiry. We could all think of appropriate issues. But I would say, in response to the member for Glasgow Central, I ran through the points about PPE. I explained why it was that James Dyson had done so much in order to ensure that ventilators could be available to all. And it's also the case, as I mentioned to a number of members earlier, that an inquiry, of course, into the handling of the pandemic is appropriate, but the important thing is that we shouldn't preempt its findings.
Jackie Doyle-Price. If not, we'll go to Stephen Farrar. Stephen Farrar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January 2020, the government was a party to the New Decade New Approach Agreement, which restored devolution to Northern Ireland. That agreement included a commitment to a panel of commissioners for ministerial standards. More recently, the Northern Ireland Assembly has given that role to the Assembly Commissioner for Standards. So why is the government prepared to support that much more rigorous approach to ministerial standards in Stormont, but not in Whitehall?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an important point, and it is the case that I applaud the cross-party working which Stormont has exhibited in making sure that the executive and ministers work well. But as I pointed out earlier, the independent advisor on ministerial standards we hope will be appointed very shortly, and it will be the case, of course, following on from a number of questions that have been put by right honourable and honourable members, that there will be an opportunity to review then what changes, if any, are needed in order to improve that role.
Steve Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure, like many members of this House, I've spent the last few days knocking on literally hundreds of doors across mid-Cornwall. And the residents of St Austell and Newquay raised a number of important issues with me. The rollout of the vaccine that is protecting them and their loved ones, the economic impact of the pandemic and what the government is doing to ensure we recover quickly, and the lifting of restrictions as we follow the roadmap that enables them to see their loved ones again and get back to life as normal in the coming weeks. The one thing nobody raised with me at all was the arrangements for refurbishing the Prime Minister's flat. So can my right honourable friend assure me that the Prime Minister and this government will remain focused on the things that really matter to the people of this country, which is getting through this pandemic and getting back to life as normal as quickly as possible?
He's spot on. Today, I had meetings on the vaccine rollout, on making sure that our justice system operates more quickly after the pandemic, on making sure that we can deal with the backlogs in the NHS as a result of elective operations having to be put aside because of the pandemic, and also looking at how we can ensure that the educational opportunities of our young people, again, scarred by the pandemic, are restored. Now, I think, others may disagree, that those are all more important issues than curtains and soft furnishings. But I leave it to others to decide.
Let's go to Dame Angela Riedel. Dame Angela.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Dominic Cummings has described the Prime Minister's plans to get Tory donors to pay for the lavish refurbishment of the Downing Street flat as, and I'm quoting, unethical, foolish and illegal. So either the Prime Minister's former chief advisor is a liar and a fantasist, or the Prime Minister is not being entirely straightforward with the House or the country. Which is it?
Minister.
As someone once said in a different context, recollections may vary.
Mr. Speaker, now the question today relates to the ministerial code and, of course, to government ministers. But has my honourable friend reflected on the fact that while the honourable lady was asking her questions, a number of her own front bench colleagues are under the direct employ of prominent and well-known lobbying companies? Yeah. Does he agree with me? If we are to look at the ministerial code, we should also look at the rules governing shadow spokesmen. Yeah.
Well, that seems to be an important point and one for the House to consider.
Evan Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In reply to my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, the Minister made a virtue that the Prime Minister had paid for the refurbishment of the Downing Street flat. Now, there's been several weeks of speculation about this, and it was only last Friday that Downing Street confirmed that he had. So, could the Minister clarify, did the Prime Minister pay the original invoices for this, or did he reimburse the donors who donated money allegedly to this fund, or to the Conservative Party?
Minister Gove.
As I pointed out earlier, the Prime Minister paid for the renovation of the flat. All donations to the Prime Minister or any other member of Parliament, or indeed to political parties, will be declared appropriately and properly. And of course, the Cabinet Secretary also made clear in his interview with hearing with the PACAC committee the background to this issue.
Let's go to Bob Blackman. Bob.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend not find it ironic that the very self-same people that are attacking the government for the process of procurement were attacking the government for the slow process of actually achieving supplies of PPE and other equipment just about a year ago today? And isn't it right that actually the government has moved heaven and earth? Ministers and civil servants have worked literally through the night often to make sure that we get through this COVID pandemic as safely as we possibly can.
Minister.
Yep. The honourable gentleman makes, I think, a very, very fair point. It was the case, entirely legitimately and appropriately, that opposition members were criticising us for the slow procurement of PPE, and the Honourable Lady for Leeds West wrote to me in order to encourage us to go faster and made a number of suggestions about companies that we should follow up, which we did do. Now, the allegation is that when political figures pressed us to procure PPE more quickly for those at the front line, that was a mistake. So either the Labour's position last spring was wrong or the position now is wrong, but they both can't be right. But may I conclude by wishing the honourable gentleman a happy birthday. It is, I understand, a very significant date, but I'm afraid the Official Secrets Act forbids me from revealing how significant.
West Street.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that the delay in locking down the country in lockdown 1, lockdown 2 and lockdown 3 led to a higher toll, both in terms of lives and livelihoods. What I don't think anyone expected was to read on the front page of the Daily Mail today the quote that the Prime Minister said, "Let the bodies pile high in their thousands," a claim which has been subsequently verified independently by other journalists. So I think the Minister takes statements he makes at that dispatch box more seriously than the Prime Minister does. So can I ask him again to be absolutely categorical that he has never heard the Prime Minister say those words, that the Prime Minister didn't say those words, and that prior to arriving in the House this afternoon, he received assurances from the Prime Minister that he didn't use those words. Can he be absolutely clear and straightforward and honest about that?
Totally. As I pointed out earlier in response to the question from the member, I think, for Aberdeen South, I made the point that I had been in a meeting in the Cabinet room with the Prime Minister. I would ordinarily go into discussions that take place in Cabinet committees for reasons that he would well understand. But I never heard the Prime Minister say any such thing. We were all wrestling with an incredibly difficult decision. The decision to lock down necessarily imposes costs in other ways, as we're all aware. But the Prime Minister not only concluded at the end of the discussion that we had, which was a sober, serious and detailed discussion, that it was necessary to have that second lockdown. He also concluded, of course, that it was necessary, sadly, to have a third lockdown as well.
Let's go to Anna Bowdell. Anna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to Opinium for the Observer, 53% of people in Scotland think that the Prime Minister is corrupt. Whether it's COVID contracts for his cronies, peerages for his pals, or tax breaks over text, the Prime Minister is leading a government that is rotten to the core and fast losing public trust. Any healthy democracy must have leaders with credibility. So will the Minister do the right thing, ensure a public inquiry happens and recognise that people in Scotland have a right to decide their own future, a future free from Tory sleaze and corruption that they did not vote for?
Minister Gove.
Well, I think we're grateful for that party election broadcast. I think the most important thing to stress is that on each of the detailed questions raised, quite understandably, by our honourable friend, the member for Glasgow Central, I explained the position, and it is not as the SNP would wish it to be.
Let's go to the final question with Rachel Hopkins. Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen a growing divergence between what government ministers say in public and their true intentions that they share in private. And the public deserves to know what the Prime Minister said to Manchester United's Ed Woodward in a meeting before the European Super League was announced, as it seems the Prime Minister gave the impression that he has supported the plans. Without full transparency, questions remain about the Prime Minister's potential breach of the Ministerial Code and Nolan Principles. So can the Minister commit the government to publish all details relating to this meeting?
Minister.
Well, I think it was clear from what the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport said in the wake of the suggestion that there should be a European Super League, that they were wholly opposed to that venture. My understanding, I wasn't there at the time, is that the conversation with Ed Woodward of Manchester United related to the broader opening up of sporting events and what the necessary social distancing or other measures might be in order to allow more of us to enjoy being able to go back to football matches.
I now suspend the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements for the next business to be made. Order.